Hello! In this lecture video, we're going to be talking about some of the things that you have in common with a baby, and with pigeons and dogs and lots of other non-human creatures. And in so doing, I will introduce the Apply project. The things that we're going to be talking about today are some really fundamental learning mechanisms. As I already said, things that you share with babies, with pigeons, with dogs, with lots and lots of things. But really, don't be fooled by that word fundamental. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's basic or simple. Although the ideas that I'm going to share with you, I hope will be a reminder from your Psych 100 class and have some straightforward applications in child psychology. The ideas that we're going to talk about can actually support some really complex and interesting forms of human behavior. So a few goals for today. The first is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what it means to apply, right? A lot of what we're going to talk about today is related to the Apply project. So what does that mean? We're going to talk about operant and classical conditioning, connect them to some real life examples, and then finally I will talk about the Apply project, and I hope to leave you with an understanding of why you're doing it and what you will actually be accomplishing. First, let's start talking about application. I want you to read through the scenario on the screen and think on your own for just maybe a minute or two about how you would approach this situation. If your friend actually asked for your advice, how would you give them, what would you advise them to do in this situation? Go ahead and pause the video for a couple of minutes and then resume it when you are ready to move on. Okay, I hope you have a couple of ideas about how you would help this person help their daughter learn Italian. Now, it is pretty likely that you gave some really solid advice in that situation. Maybe you've even tried to learn a language yourself, and so you used your own experiences with what worked well for you as you gave that advice. Now, I want to drill down a little bit more into what form that advice took. You already know enough psychology to give evidence-based or research-based advice about the most effective way to learn a second language. So now with this in mind, let's take a look at the situation again. Represent that situation for you so you can reread it. How would you do this? Which specific psychology concepts would you use to help in this situation? If that question is really challenging, you're not really sure where to start, here's a little bit of a hint. I encourage you to think about what you learned about human learning and memory in both your Psych 100 class and already in child psychology. So once again, please pause the video for just a minute or two, maybe jot down a couple of ideas if you're taking notes, and then resume it when you're ready to hear what I think. All right, welcome back. So, when I read that situation, a lot of ideas just popped into my mind. Here is a non-exhaustive list of concepts that you could use to help an 8-year-old learn a new language. Operant conditioning, reinforcement, attention, specifically selective attention, like we will talk about later this semester. Retrieval practice using the spacing effect. Right? These are many, many ideas that I'm drawing on from, like I said, Psych 100, but also from this class. I don't want to go through each and every concept here. That's not really the point of this lecture, nor is it the point of this exercise that I'm walking through with you. The point of this is to for you to recognize that my list probably looks quite different from yours. Now, if this were an in-person class and I had some people in front of me, I would do a little bit of a temperature check and I would ask my students, like, okay, how did that feel? Was that hard? Was that easy? Was it somewhere in between? And since I can't do that in this remote setting, I'll instead tell you what normally happens when I do that temperature check. Normally, people tell me that this exercise is really, really challenging, right? Some of those concepts from that last screen, maybe you took Psych 100 a year ago or more than a year ago. So you might not remember that stuff, right? That was probably a difficult exercise. Now, why was that so hard? In order to talk about why that was so difficult, let me describe to you what my goals for you are in this classroom. I'll use an example, like the active child idea, right? When I teach you about the active child idea in a lecture video, yeah, I definitely do want you to get some test questions about that idea correct. But my goals for you, and I hope your goals for yourself, extend beyond just getting some points on an exam question. What I really want is for you to use that knowledge in a space outside the classroom. I want you to understand how this idea has shaped your own development or the development of children in your life around you, right? So what I want you to do is to take that idea from the context that you learned it, which is in a classroom, and apply it and use it in a new context, your real life. This is something that cognitive psychologists call transfer. When you take an idea from one spot and then you use it somewhere else, you are transferring that knowledge from one place to another. By the way, that word transfer, just plain extra for you, but it really helps explain this concept of applying, so I'm going to keep using it. Now, unfortunately, transfer failure, so the inability to take something you've learned in one context and use it in another, transfer failure is extremely common. It is very common both in the research literature on education and cognition, and I imagine it's probably something that you can relate to as well, right? This is what we mean when we say that knowledge is inert, right? You take it in one setting, in one context, and then it just kind of sits there. You can't do anything with it. You can't use it, right? That makes it inert. And as a partial result of it being inert, it is very, very forgettable. So let me share with you an example of a time that I experienced transfer failure that you might be able to relate to. For me, the times that I can think about most clearly where I experienced transfer failure were in my math classes. So I would do all of the problems in the homework sets. I would sometimes even go outside of the homework and do extra problems that were not assigned for homework because I needed more practice to actually learn or to remember the routines and procedures that I was supposed to follow. But then when I got to the test, I would look at a problem and it felt like just one thing was different, right? Like one number was different, one symbol was different, or the setup of the equation was different, and I had no idea what to do with it. That's transfer failure. I practiced these skills in one setting on the homework, and then I could not transfer them to a new setting to that exam. So Why does this happen, right? It's pretty unfortunate that transfer failure is such a consistent problem across many different types of education and across all different educational levels, right? All the way from the youngest children to adult learners have this problem. So why? Well, one reason is that you don't understand and remember the concepts, right? So some of the concepts on that last slide, they're from your Psych 100 class. If you do not remember what retrieval practice is, you're probably not going to transfer it to help you solve a problem in a new situation, right? So if you don't have that solid foundation of remembering and understanding, you're not going to be able to apply. The next problem is that sometimes, in fact, I would say most times, the real world is just way more complicated than anything that you see in your textbook, right? This was something that always really frustrated me while I was learning psychology. When I would read through examples in the textbook, they'd be so clear. They'd be so obvious. This is obviously an example of operant conditioning, right? But there's a reason they call them textbook examples, right? It's because they're exceptionally clear. The real world is way more messy than your textbook. There are always going to be multiple factors going on and multiple things that may be interfering with one another in the same situation, and it can be really difficult to try and pick out which of the dimensions of that situation are relevant and which dimensions you can actually apply to a concept from your textbook, right? I have been studying psychology since I was 18, so a long, long time. And I have really a lot of background knowledge of psychology. So when I look at that situation of a person trying to learn a new language, almost, maybe not instantly, but within a minute or two, I can come up with a list like that, right? Those concepts just jump into my mind because I know that they're going to be relevant anytime that you are learning. But this kind of expertise took a really long time for me to build up. You are still a relative beginner in psychology and in child development in particular, right? So if that was really difficult for you, I kind of expected that, and it is at least in part a result of the fact that you are still new to this domain or this subject, and you're still new to solving problems in this subject. Which brings me to my last point. Transferring knowledge from one place to another is something that you can get better at. This is a skill. You can work on it and you can improve it. I really, really hope that the language that I'm using here sounds familiar to you, right? I used the words remember and understand. I talked about applying. That's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about applying. So application is when you take something that you learned in your child psychology class and then you use it somewhere else, like maybe in your real life, right? And I'm putting this beautiful rainbow pyramid up here on the slide one more time to really emphasize to you the foundation of the pyramid. Remember and understand are at the base for a reason, because you need to remember and understand the content before you can actually get to that application. So by this point in the semester, you've already done some of that really hard work to remember and understand, right? You've done some self-references, you've taken some quizzes, you've read the textbook, you have some knowledge. Now, let's see what we can do to use that knowledge. So let's talk about the Apply project. Just quick note about this picture. This was the first image that came up on my search engine when I typed confused child into my search engine. So hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Anyway, on to the project. So the instructions for the Apply project are on D2L. They're also on in your Google Drive folder. And in the Google Drive folder, you'll also find full examples of what your submission could look like. So please check that out if you have any questions. I'm not going to go through all the detailed instructions here, so I really do encourage you to read that handout before you begin your project. So, broad strokes of what's going on here. There are 2 options for you to complete this project, and you only need to choose one of them to do. The first option, this is a good option if you interact with children in a regular basis. Maybe you are a parent, maybe you have a younger sibling or a cousin or a child that you babysit for. This would be a great option for you if you want to actually use these concepts in your real life. So you can choose to apply either operant and or classical conditioning to your real life. And you can use these concepts to either solve a problem that a child is experiencing, change a routine, or establish a new routine or habit. Also, one thing I will note is that although you yourself are in all likelihood not a child, if you are a child and watching this video, taking this class, good job, I'm impressed. But in all likelihood, you're not a child. However, the same principles are still going to apply to you at whatever stage of life you're in. So you can also choose to use yourself as the person who's actually trying to solve a problem, routine, or break a habit or start a habit, whatever, right? So a child or yourself for option number 1. Option number 2 is if you do not have access to a child in your life outside of the classroom, or you just don't want to do that option, you can instead choose to role play with generative artificial intelligence and give the AI some advice. In short, the AI will play the role of a parent with a child that has a behavioral problem of your choosing or wants to build a habit of your choosing, and you are going to give the AI advice using either classical or operant conditioning to help them. So briefly, the reason that I chose operant and classical conditioning for this project is because these are foundational concepts. So the things that we learn about them here are going to support our knowledge for the remainder of the class. And the second reason that I picked them is because these concepts are things that really can make a huge difference in your life outside the classroom if you learn how to apply them. So I want to give you some practice with doing this. So I want to talk about the concepts individually, and then I'll give you some examples of situations or problems you can apply them to. So we'll start with classical conditioning. Depending on your previous psychology classes, you may have heard this as Pavlovian conditioning, but I'm going to refer to it as classical conditioning, right? If you remember the famous experiment with Ivan Pavlov and his dogs, right? He got the dogs to salivate in response to the sound of a bell by repeatedly pairing the appearance of some food with the sound of this bell. Turns out classical conditioning is not just for dogs. You and I can use it to make our lives better as well. In Psych 100, you had a bunch of terms that you needed to remember and be able to discriminate from one another, right? Things like the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response and conditioned response. The good news is, in this class, you don't need to remember all of those individual terms. We are just going to stick with the basic idea of classical conditioning. And it is my hope that you'll find the basic idea to be pretty straightforward. So let's go over that basic idea. In classical conditioning, you are learning that the environment is not random. You're learning to associate 2 stimuli or 2 things in the environment. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you are fortunate enough to live in a place where someone feeds you dinner every single day. Be pretty nice, right? Now further imagine that you get fed dinner at the same exact time every single day. So here's how it works. On day 1, the clock hits 6 p.m., and then right in front of you, dinner appears. On day 2, you look up at the clock, you see it says 6 p.m., and then bam, as if by magic, dinner appears. On day 3, you look up at the clock, you see it says 6 p.m., and then, oh my gosh, right in front of you, dinner appears. On day 4, are you getting bored yet? You look up at the clock, it says 6 p.m. What do you think is going to happen? If you are like screaming to yourself, oh my gosh, Dr. Gray, you're going to get dinner. You are correct. Excellent job. You just learned classical conditioning. You just learned that the environment is non-random, right? You learned that I can predict when I'm going to get dinner every time I see 6 o'clock, right? Because I repeatedly paired 6 o'clock with the appearance of dinner. So every time 6 o'clock happens, you get fed dinner. And really, that's it. That is the meat, if you will, of classical conditioning. You are learning to associate 2 different things in your environment. In this case, the time on the clock and getting fed dinner. So now, let me give you an example of a problem that you can solve with classical conditioning. This is a self-reference. In case you were unaware of this, sometimes it is challenging to get babies to go to sleep. I myself have not actually tried to get a baby to go to sleep, so I imagine that this is a bit of an understatement. When I was a baby, my parents had this trouble. They needed a consistent way to get me to go to sleep. It was challenging to make me get sleepy around the right time, and my parents really struggled with trying to get me to go to bed in a consistent manner. As you may also remember, my dad is a psychology professor, and he knows about classical conditioning. He knows how to use this to solve his problems. So, here is what he did. My dad used classical conditioning to help me go to sleep. My parents chose this album that you see on the screen here called the Bliss album. It's by a hip hop group named PM Dawn. And near my bedtime, my parents would put this album on, and then my dad would pick me up and dance around with me to the first 3 songs of the album. This effectively got me tired out. The 4th song on the album was slower, calmer, and by that time, he would start rocking me, and I fell asleep. My dad and mom did this repeatedly, right? They put on the album, they got me tired out, and then they rocked me to sleep to that 4th song. So for years afterwards, my parents would put this album on to help me start to feel sleepy and to go to sleep. So what did I learn to associate here? I learned to associate 2 things, right? My bedtime with this album. I can predict that it's my bedtime when I hear this album, just like I can predict that it's dinner time, or I'm going to get fed dinner when I see that clock and it says 6 p.m., right? So now when you present this album alone, that's enough to get me sleepy because I know that means, bedtime is coming soon. All right, let me share one more example of classical conditioning, and then we'll move on to operant conditioning. So, this is a problem that I experienced in 2021. Let me tell you a short story. In September of 2021, I was doing a long, difficult race that took place on at a ski resort, so on a mountain in Vermont. I had just finished the last big climb of the race, and so everything was literally downhill from there. My legs just felt so awful, so heavy, could barely pick them up. I was so tired. At the top of this climb, I stopped paying attention to where I was putting my feet for, I swear to gosh, just like 2 seconds. But that's all it took. My attention wandered, and next thing I know, I had tripped over a rock and then bashed my knee open on another rock. And as it turns out, I had a pretty serious injury. I ended up getting 19 stitches while I was in Vermont, and I did not finish that race. As a result of this injury, I developed a fear of trail running. This fear was formed through classical conditioning, and I won't go into this, but if you remember anything from your intro psych class, it was maintained through operant conditioning, as many fears are if you think about avoidance, right? However, it's really important for me as an athlete to be a good trail runner. If I want to achieve my athletic goals, I need to be able to get out there and run proficiently on a trail. So in April of the following year, I did a trail half marathon that I specifically chose because it had some elevation change in it. While I was in this race, in the middle of this race, I was struck with something that was really close to, but maybe not all the way, close to a panic attack. If you've never had a panic attack before, let me just say a little bit about them. They are extremely unpleasant, and that actually is an understatement that I can vouch for. The specific symptoms that people have when they experience panic attacks really vary from person to person. So for me, it felt like my heart was beating so fast that I could not control it. My breath felt constricted, like my chest would not expand when I breathed, so I felt like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. My thoughts were racing. Sometimes people I had like shortness of breath, right? Sometimes people go to the emergency department because they think they're having a heart attack. That's how scary these panic attacks can be. So, because I am a psychologist, after I was done with the acute incident of having or almost having a panic attack, I was thinking to myself, like, what just happened? What am I going through right now? I know that fears are very frequently classically conditioned. So I knew that I had formed some association the last time that I had been trail running and that I had sustained that serious injury. But my question was, what did I associate? What on earth happened that triggered that outsized fear response in me, right? I clearly learned to associate something with that giant hole in my skin. So what is that thing? After thinking about it for a little while, I realized it was climbing a hill, right? The same exact feeling in my legs before I fell on the mountain, that's what I was feeling in my legs before I had that panic attack on this trail. So I learned to associate climbing a hill with this serious injury. So now what, right? It's all well and good. I have this knowledge, but what can I do with this knowledge? I used a concept called counter conditioning to help me solve this problem. As a side note, the vocabulary terms you're going to see on this slide are just plain extra. You don't need to know them. But if you choose to use this strategy for your apply project, I do want to talk about how it works. The essence of counter conditioning is this. Once you recognize that something is classically conditioned, you've learned to associate two things, you can use what you know about classical conditioning to effectively uncondition it or break that association, break that link. So what you want to do is replace your original response, which for me was that paralyzing fear, with a new response that is incompatible. This is going to look different for each and every person that practices counter conditioning, but for me, I focused on three things. Two things that are on the slide and then one additional thing. While I was running, I practiced relaxing my body. I practiced not holding tension in my arms and my jaw and my throat. And I practiced breathing deeply. And finally, I talked to one of my favorite people in the whole world, my dad. You can see in that picture right there. This is actually the day of the race that I had this panic response. It is impossible for me to be panicking while I am practicing deep breathing and relaxing and talking to my dad, right? So the idea here is we want to replace this original panic response with the more adaptive response of relaxation, breathing deeply, talking to my dad, that's incompatible with panic. As a additional side note, something that you don't need to know for this class but might just be interesting to you, this is the basis of exposure therapy. This is how that functions in a therapeutic setting. Last thing about classical conditioning before we go on, I hope that those two examples were really interesting to you, but maybe they weren't. So why should you care about it? Here's a bunch of questions about being a human being and about being a child. As it turns out, all of these questions can be explained using classical conditioning. So, like I said at the beginning, these really foundational or fundamental learning mechanisms can support some really high level behaviors like panic disorder or advertising. Okay, so now let's move on to operant conditioning. First, let me contrast this with classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, the response that you are eliciting is not voluntary, right? So when I was a baby, I did not choose to feel sleepy when my parents played that album for me. When I fell on that hill, and then when I was running that race, I did not choose to have a panic response. Those are involuntary behaviors. With operant conditioning, we are now talking about voluntary behaviors, or things that you have control over, that you choose to do. In this case, you are learning to associate voluntary behaviors with the consequences of those behaviors, right? For example, let's say watching a lecture video. That is a behavior that you are choosing to do, right? It is not automatic. If you watch a lecture video and it is so boring, it puts you to sleep, you don't learn anything interesting in it, you're probably not going to watch any more lecture videos, right? That makes sense because you're learning from the consequences of that first one. You watched it, nothing good came of it, so why would you watch more? Let's say on the other hand, you watch a lecture video and you're like, wow, that's pretty cool. I feel like that concept that I just learned about, that might actually help me in my real life. I liked that explanation. It made sense to me. You just learned something, and hopefully you enjoyed that process of learning it. You're probably going to watch another lecture video in the future, right? Those are the consequences of that voluntary behavior, and depending on the consequences, you will behave differently in the future. There are two general types of consequences that I want you to know in this class: reinforcements and punishments. The way we decide whether something is a reinforcement or a punishment is by asking this question: did the behavior the voluntary behavior in question increase or decrease in frequency after the consequence. This will tell you whether something is a reinforcement or a punishment, right? In my example about watching lecture videos, if you thought the lecture video was boring and you didn't learn anything, that would be a punishment. Those feelings, those negative feelings of boredom, of wasting your time, that's a punishment. And that will decrease your frequency of watching lecture videos in the future. Conversely, if you felt really pretty good after watching that lecture video, or you enjoyed something that you learned, those positive feelings are good consequences. They are going to increase the frequency that you watch future lecture videos. So that's a reinforcement. One connection that you might have to this concept is with discipline. If you've ever given a child or a dog a reward when they did something that you asked or when they behaved well, that's operant conditioning. You're trying to encourage that behavior in the future by rewarding it or reinforcing it. So I have a couple of examples of operant conditioning. The first is a problem. The problem is my feet really hurt, but I'm very unmotivated to do anything about it. My problem is I love running, but I have been plagued by overuse injuries for a couple of years. Specifically right now, I'm dealing with something called Achilles tendinopathy. It's just basically my Achilles tendons hurt all the time, and it's really pretty annoying. I know what I'm supposed to do. I have been to physical therapy on 2 separate occasions to treat this problem and a related problem. So I know what I'm supposed to do. But the issue is it's so boring to be just doing calf raises for what feels like 20 minutes, right? This hopefully, theoretically, will lead to long-term good consequences and that my feet won't hurt anymore. But right now, it is not immediately rewarding, or it is not immediately reinforcing. So a solution is to change that, to make it immediately rewarding. Broadly, what I want you to think about here is that you have power over the consequences of many of your actions. If you're not satisfied with the consequences of some behavior and you want to make it into a habit, change the consequences. So I used reinforcement to establish a reward system for myself. Here's how it works for me. Every time I do one exercise to strengthen my calf muscles or my feet or my hips or something, I earn 1 point. I can exchange these points for prizes, things that I want, not something that I need, something that I want, something that I will find really rewarding. For example, when I earn 45 points, I can exchange those points for a foot massage. These points are reinforcement because the goal is to increase the frequency with which I am doing those physical therapy exercises. I also keep a visual record of how many points I'm earning on a wall calendar. This is something that helps me feel pride in my accomplishment. When I look at how many points I've accumulated, I feel really good about myself. I feel satisfied that I'm actually sticking to this plan that I've made. And that positive feeling is another reward, another reinforcement. Again, although I'm talking about myself here, you can use yourself as an option for this project, or you can do this with kids. Right? The rewards you use will probably be different, but you can definitely set up a system of rewards that will motivate someone to do something, to start a habit, or to solve a problem. Okay, couple more here. this is a different type of problem that I want to share with you. And this one is that emotions are kind of hard, right? When I was a kid, I, like many kids, sometimes got upset and cried. I don't actually have any pictures of me crying. This is my youngest brother, G, possibly my favorite picture of them of all time. So, one solution to this problem of crying and getting upset is called a coping mechanism. So I want to talk about the specific coping mechanism that I used when I was a kid. I had a stuffed animal that I really, really, really loved. And whenever I was upset, cuddling with that stuffed animal always made me feel better. This is what it looked like when I received the stuffed animal as a birthday gift in 1996. So now let's figure out if we're talking about a reinforcement or a punishment. That cuddling behavior is voluntary. I'm choosing to do it. So does this behavior increase in frequency or decrease in frequency as a result of feeling better after cuddling? Well, my bad emotions went away, right? I felt better. So this is an example of a reinforcement. It is so reinforcing, in fact, that I kept this stuffed animal for 27 years and counting, and I used it as a coping mechanism to help me feel better long into my childhood. This is what it looks like now. More broadly, coping mechanisms are reinforced and increase in frequency because they relieve bad emotions. Some coping mechanisms are perfectly healthy, right? Things like if you're a child, cuddling a stuffed animal to make you feel better, totally normal. Things like exercise can be healthy. Things like talking it out with a friend, that can be healthy. But there are other coping mechanisms that are not so healthy. Things like avoiding a problem so that you don't have to think about it, or using drugs or alcohol to numb a feeling that you were having. These may relieve bad emotions temporarily, and because they do, they will be reinforced, right? So the point I'm making here is that not all coping mechanisms are equally healthy, and which ones are appropriate for a given situation will vary based on the person and, of course, the circumstances that a person is in. The last example that I want to give you of operant conditioning is regrettably another self-reference. When I was a kid, I can only remember lying to my parents a single time. Really, truly, I had a very strong conscience. So on this time that I lied to my parents, I didn't last very long. Maybe a couple of hours before I was a teenager, I broke down and they caught me. And when I came home, my parents didn't yell. They didn't scream. They sat me down and they looked at me and they said, "Maureen, we're very disappointed in you." And I just felt like I wanted to shrivel up right there and stop existing. Oh, that hurt. That was so bad. So this is the voluntary behavior, the lying, right? Does lying increase or decrease in frequency as a result of my parents telling me they're very disappointed in me? Well, it decreased. I never did it again. So this is a punishment, right? Now, in most situations, you're going to have to repeatedly pair the behavior with the consequence in order to get long-term learning. But this was a special case where the consequence was so powerful, so salient, that it took one time for me to learn. All right, nope, never going to do that again. All right, few extra words about consequences if you're trying to modify some behavior. First, consequences are much more effective when they are administered immediately after the behavior occurs, right? That's why I have changed the, with my physical therapy exercises, not immediately rewarding. So I started making it immediately rewarding by giving myself points so that I could, earn something with those points. So if you're trying to implement a reward system or a punishment system, do not, especially for a kid, do not wait an hour later before you give them the point or whatever it is. Do not wait an hour later before you administer the praise or the punishment. It needs to be immediate. The next thing is that you have to be consistent. When you set up a system, you can't reward someone only sometimes or punish them only sometimes. You need to follow through with those consequences, both good and bad. You are on the honor system here, right? If you want change in your own life, you have to be, you have to hold yourself to those standards. And then, as I just mentioned, you have to use repeated pairings of the behavior and the consequence. Next, reinforcement is generally more effective than punishment at modifying a behavior or changing a habit, breaking a habit, etc. That's because reinforcement explicitly tells you what you should do, right? Because you get rewarded for doing the right behavior. Whereas punishment only tells you what you're not supposed to do, but you may not be sure what you are supposed to do instead. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention is that sometimes if you provide an external reward, like money or a point for doing something, that sometimes reduces how internally rewarding something is. So for example, if you wanted to encourage a child to read more, you may think, well, I'll just pay the child $5 every time they finish a book. That is an external reward, those $5, right? Problem is, when those rewards stop, the behavior may weaken. Because if you find something intrinsically rewarding, like reading is fun, but then you give someone $5 to keep reading, the behavior has now 2 rewards associated with it. And that often results in the reduction of that more internal or intrinsic reward of just enjoying the reading for reading itself. To address this problem, researchers recommend that you emphasize those intrinsic rewards along with the $5 that you give, right? So reframe the setup as you're getting $5, but you're also getting to enjoy this really exciting book. You're also getting to learn about this new world, and how cool is that, right? So if you can actually strengthen intrinsic motivation in this way by talking about how the behavior that the child or that yourself is doing, or that you are doing, is indicative of increased competence and increased success. So those things are intrinsic to the process itself, right? So maybe the reward is not for finishing the book exactly, but the reward is for increased reading capability. Oh, you're better at reading now. Isn't that so great? You're getting more competence. And competence is something that's internal to a person. So if they're being rewarded for that intrinsic thing, the thinking goes, maybe that's less likely to decrease after the external rewards are taken away. All right, this was already quite a long video, so I'm not going to spend some time talking about the second option for the Apply project in this video. I'll record a separate one to walk you through what that looks like and how your submissions should look. So I hope that this video was helpful for you in talking about classical and operant conditioning and applications to your life, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.